Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining this session on changes to skilled worker visas and some other immigration changes. And move to the first slide, which is the agenda. We can run through what we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk about changes to skilled worker visas, which are just about to come into force on the 4th of April, some changes to the shortage occupation list, some exceptions to the sort of general rules and some transitional arrangements that are going to protect existing people already in the route before the changes take effect. Some recent changes to the immigration health surcharge, illegal working civil penalty increases, some changes to the business visit rules, and a forthcoming review to the graduate route. So there's lots to get through and lots of different topics there, but hopefully we will give you a quick overview of all of those. So before we start to go through the actual changes, I just wanted to put some context around the changes that we're going to discuss. And the changes to the immigration rules that are coming in on the 4th of April are some of the most significant to our immigration rules since the end of the Brexit transition period. Some of you will remember at that time that the skilled worker route was introduced for the first time, replacing the old Tier 2 rules, and the resident labour market test, etc., was abolished. So those were the sort of previous really significant changes, and these are the biggest set of changes we've had since. And the reforms that we're going to talk about will make it harder for employers to sponsor employees to work in the UK, especially in those lower sort of level, lower paid jobs, etc. And in terms of why the changes came about, the ONS statistics in terms of net migration figures in the year to June 2023 were published last year and showed that net migration to the UK was up at 672,000 people, which was much higher than pre-pandemic levels. And that includes not just work routes, but also students and family migration. And there's been a huge increase in the number of carers, etc., coming to the UK, and also international students. And in response to those statistics, the Home Secretary announced on the 4th of December this sort of 5-point plan, which was that certain immigration changes were going to be introduced to try to reduce net migration. And they say that the cumulative effect of all of these changes is that there should be a reduction in around 300,000 people able to come to the UK. So you can see that's a really major shift in policy if it's going to roughly half the numbers coming to the UK across the various different changes. Today, we're just talking about the work routes. There are changes to family visas, etc., that might impact some of your staff, but we're not going to cover those today. So if we just move on to the first slide then, on skilled worker visa changes. Next slide, please. So for those of you who've used the skilled worker route, you will know that currently there's a number of different salary requirements that you need to be aware of. There's the general salary threshold, and there's some different levels of that depending on the circumstances. There's also a going rate for the specific job code that you match the role up to. And there's often also an hourly minimum rate as well that needs to be paid. So the changes that are due to come in on the 4th of April will involve a significant increase in that general minimum salary threshold. So that's due to increase from the current level of 26,200 to 38,700. And that figure's been talked about a lot in the press. Many of you will have heard of it. And the reason that there's such a significant change is that they're moving it up from, it was previously pegged to the kind of lower quartile of salary data for eligible jobs in the skilled worker route, and that's going up to be pegged to the median level. So across the board, significant increases, but that general threshold, that's a really big jump up in minimum rates of pay. In terms of the second requirement that I mentioned, the going rate for the particular job code, those are also going to now be pegged to median salary levels going forward rather than that lower quartile. That's a change that less employers maybe are aware of, because although that headline figure has been talked about a lot, the changes to the going rates will also make a big difference. So new applicants to the skilled worker route for the first time from the 4th of April will have to meet these new median levels for the going rates. The hourly rate is also going to go up. So under the current rules, the general rate is £10.75 an hour, and the employer's got to pay the higher of all of those three different measures. That's going to jump up to an hourly rate of £15.88 per hour, or there's a sort of discounted rate for health and care visas of £11.90 per hour. So they're pretty significant changes in terms of the basic sort of eligibility criteria. It's worth saying, though, that there will be special protective transitional arrangements put in place, and they're for people already in the skilled worker route before the 4th of April, or for those who've already had a certificate of sponsorship issued to them prior to the 4th of April. And these transitional arrangements will be in place for many years to come, up until April 2030. And that's good news, because otherwise certain individuals already in the UK wouldn't have necessarily been able to satisfy the new requirements, and it would have caused them a disadvantage. So there's a good reason for them to be there. But that will lead to increased complexity for employers, because you're going to be looking at now two sets of rules going forward: the current or old regime, and then the new regime for new people into the skilled worker route from the 4th of April onwards. So you've got the sort of dual set of rules with different criteria, different going rates, different general salary thresholds, etc. For those on these transitional arrangements, then they will be subject to the previous sort of general salary threshold, albeit updated for the latest pay data. So there's inflationary type changes to those rates of pay, which mean instead of the general threshold being 26,200, it will be a minor increase up to 29,000. The hourly rate of pay will go up to £11.90 per hour instead of the £10.75, etc. But all of their going rates will be pegged to that lower quartile instead of the median. So two sets of rules, all three requirements will be slightly different depending on whether somebody's a sort of pre-4th of April person or not. The other point to note is that the occupation codes, everybody's used to probably matching up jobs with these SOC codes that everybody talks about. Currently, those are all based on SOC 2010. Those are all going to be revised and refreshed to be based on SOC 2020 job codes. So it's important to be working with the right list if you're looking them up. But there will again be transitional arrangements in place. So if somebody's job code's been deleted and doesn't exist on the SOC 2020 list, there will be protective measures in place to ensure that they are still catered for when they come to change their visa, extend or settle in the UK, etc. So if we just move on to the next slide, I'm now going to mention, I guess we've had the sort of basics of the new skilled worker rules. There will be various different salary discounts still available under the new rules. So although that headline figure sounds very high, there are various different exceptions to it. The first exception or special case that I wanted to mention is health and care visas, and also those individuals who are sponsored under certain health and education SOC 2020 job codes, which are going to be listed out in a table in the rules, which are subject to national pay scales. So there will be special rules in place for them. They're not going to have to comply with this 38,700 general salary requirement, and their going rates will also be pegged to the lower salary quartile or the national pay rates, etc. So special cases there for them. The second set of salary discounts that I wanted to mention is that all of the current discounts that we've got for new entrants, and those are people that are either under 26 years old or switching from graduate visas or switching from student visas, etc., there will still be discounts available for them, but the actual minimum rates of pay are going to increase. Same as there'll be special discounts available for people with a PhD in a subject that's relevant to the job, and even better discounts for people with a PhD in a STEM subject which is relevant to the job. The main change to the salary discounts is in relation to the shortage occupation list, which I will come on to talk about in more detail in a moment. But you can see on the slide there, I've put up the new entrant minimum salary threshold, which is going up by about £10,000. In fact, all of these general thresholds are going up by about £10,000. So new applicants from the 4th of April even though you benefit from these discounted rates, they're going to be significantly higher than the current general minimums that we've got. There will also be percentage discounts off the going rate for new entrants and those with PhDs. Shortage occupation list is a bit different on that front, and I will come on to talk about that. So the main message is that the current rules are easier to satisfy if you've got people that can satisfy the requirements currently that won't be able to meet the new requirements. You might want to jump in and sponsor them before the rules change on the 4th of April. So I said I was going to touch on the shortage occupation list. That's the next topic I'm going to talk about. It's going to be replaced with an immigration salary list. So it's going to be rebranded, renamed, and it's a shorter list than it was before. These changes are also coming in on the 4th of April. The Migration Advisory Committee, which is the expert body that advises the government on immigration policy, was commissioned to carry out what they call a rapid review. They basically had to do it very quickly to look at what jobs are sensible to include on this new immigration salary list. And the purpose of it's changed a little bit. It's not to include every job that's in short supply, but it's only to include those where it's also sensible to offer a discounted salary threshold. And they published a report on the 23rd of February. Those changes have now made their way into the Statement of Immigration rule changes, which was published just last week. And as a result, there will be a discounted general threshold applicable to jobs on this new immigration salary list. There's two different levels depending on whether somebody is on a health and care visa or a standard visa. And I've put the numbers up there. You can see that that's a fair discount off the sort of general threshold. But the big news is that there won't be a going rate discount anymore. So it used to be that shortage occupation list jobs got a discount from the going rate. Instead, employers will have to pay the higher of the general discounted salary threshold or the full 100% of the going rate. And that might actually wipe out some of the benefit of that reduced general threshold. Shortage occupation list jobs currently benefit from reduced visa fees, and that I think will continue to be the case. So there's still some benefits of a job being on that immigration salary list. In terms of the range of jobs on it, previously there was about 30% of skilled worker jobs on the list. Going forward, that will be around 8%. So you will see that there's a significant reduction of the jobs that will appear on there. So it's going to be a less commonly used discount than before. If we just, move on. So I put up here a couple of tables, which will hopefully be helpful if you take away the slides. This is a table pulling together all of those different minimum salary levels, depending on what discounts or particular circumstances apply. So these are the current rules pre-4th of April. And you can see there the minimum salary levels are around about 20-odd thousand across the board. So whatever discounts were applicable, they're in the 20s. The minimum hourly rate was that £10.75 an hour, and it was based on those 2010 SOC codes. And if we just move on to the next slide, that shows you from the 4th of April onwards, the new requirements with the various, even with the various discounts applied, we're still talking about salaries that start generally in the 30-odd thousand. So there's roughly a sort of 10 or more £1,000 increase across the board. The only major discounted one that still exists is for those jobs listed on health or education SOC codes. And also Gregor will talk about the special case for health and care visas later, which also benefit from more reduced salaries. But you can see across the board a big jump up in minimum salary levels, the hourly rate gone up to £15.88 per hour, the change in SOC codes, and the percentage discount still generally applicable to the going rates apart from shortage occupation list jobs, but those are going to be pegged to that median level instead of the lower quartile, which will make a big difference. So generally much higher salary requirements across the board. If we just move on to the next slide then. So I've mentioned transitional arrangements in place before, but I just wanted to put up onto the slide a little bit more of that so that you can see for people who are already in the skilled worker route before the 4th of April, and that's no later than the 3rd of April, that's the last day, for people to get and sort of get the benefit of the old rules. If they are issued with the certificate of sponsorship up to the 3rd of April, they'll also be able to benefit from these transitional arrangements, although we would recommend people go ahead and apply for their visas before that cut-off date as well, just to be sure that you're going to benefit from the old rules. But they won't need to meet this new higher salary threshold. They will be based on going rates pegged at that lower quartile level. There will be a lower hourly rate applicable, £11.90, because it's not sort of frozen in time. It's being reviewed from the current rates to take account of latest salary data. And then up there, I won't go through each of those levels, but you'll see these are the new rates that are going to apply to new entrants, etc., for those people covered by these transitional arrangements. So this is your old regime rules. They're on the slide and you'll have them to take away. And if we just move on, I am now going to hand over to Gregor to talk about health and care visas.
Thanks very much, Elaine. So a significant part of the net migration figures have been made up by individuals coming to work in the health and care sector and their family members as well, particularly those who've been using the government's health and care visa scheme. So this visa is part of the skilled worker route, so most of the same requirements apply to these versions of the visa. But if an individual and their sponsor can meet some additional health and care related requirements, they can benefit from some concessions under this route, including some exemptions from paying the immigration health surcharge, as well as reduced visa application fees and a dedicated team at the Home Office for hopefully fast visa processing. So these benefits are all staying in place, as is mentioned at the end of this slide, but there will be some changes to the minimum salary requirements. So for the first time, the health and care visa provisions are actually being inserted into the immigration rules rather than purely being in the policy documentation. But under the old system, or the current system as we've got it, individuals would need to meet the minimum salary requirement of between £20,960 and £26,200, which depends on the role in question and any concessions that are available, or if it's higher, the going rate. Or, as the case may be, a slightly reduced going rate depending on the job and the concessions available. But under the new rules, the minimum salary requirement will be increasing on an inflationary type basis to between 23,200 and 29,000, depending on the job and what concessions are available. So the going rate or the occupational salary threshold, where applicable, will be staying at the lower quartile, although these figures will be brought up to date, but they will not be increasing to the median, like for other standard skilled worker visas. So for anyone who will be sponsoring a new member of staff in a health and care role occupation, you might want to consider whether the individual would be eligible for a health and care visa rather than a standard skilled worker visa because of this lower minimum general salary threshold that will apply. So you'd be looking at a minimum salary of around 29,000 or a discount of that amount rather than 38,700 or a discount of that amount. Additionally, if you have anyone who is being paid on or around the current minimum for this role and you want to start sponsoring them, you might want to think about doing this before the new minimum increase comes into force on the 4th of April. So on to the next slide. I thought it would be worth going on to talk about care workers and senior care workers specifically, as these are two job codes which have recently faced some changes that came into force on the 11th of March 2024. It's only these two job codes affected, so that's codes 6145 and 6146, soon to be job codes 6135 and 6136 under the 2020 SOC codes. But since the 11th of March, applicants who submit visa applications on or after that date can no longer bring dependents to the UK with them. So this is one of the measures intended to reduce net migration. There are transitional arrangements in place for anyone who was sponsored as a health and care worker under this visa before the 11th of March. They'll still be able to bring dependents to the UK, have them join them in the UK, as was the case under the old rules. And those dependents can also continue to extend their existing visas with the main applicant and eventually settle if they meet the conditions for settlement. A further change is that social care firms in England will need to be registered with the Care Quality Commission if they're doing regulated activities, if they want to be able to sponsor job code 6145 and 6146. There are also transitional arrangements in place for those who were sponsored before this was a requirement, when this requirement came in on the 11th of March. Those transitional arrangements mean that if they were sponsored before that date and they're just extending their visa with the same sponsor, their sponsor is not required to be registered purely for the purposes of that individual's application. However, if the sponsored care worker will be changing sponsor, so working for another employer, being sponsored in that role, the new employer will need to be registered with the Care Quality Commission to be able to sponsor them. Because of this requirement, sponsors should be clear if their staff will be completing any work in England, if they're to be sponsored in these job codes, so that the Home Office can confirm and check whether the appropriate registration's been obtained, or whether registration is not required. For example, if the individual's working wholly in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, i.e. not at all in England. So on the next slide, I thought it'd be worth highlighting some further changes coming up in the rules. So there's more changes affecting other visa types. So for example, creative workers, some scale-up visa salary increases, seasonal workers, and partner routes. I thought I'd flag that they're there, but we're not going to cover them just now. But I did want to flag that the rules on supplementary employment have changed. So this is work over and above the job that the employee is sponsored to do. So the key change is that a skilled worker can now do supplementary employment in any job that would be eligible for sponsorship under the skilled worker route. So it could be in any job code, not just in the same occupation or same professional level as the sponsored role, as was previously the requirement. The other requirements do still remain in place. So the supplementary employment can only be for up to 20 hours per week. They must still be doing the work for their current employer in their sponsored role, and the supplementary employment must be outside of their contracted hours. There have also been some adjustments to the global business mobility route, including the minimum salary requirements for senior and specialist worker, which are shown on the slide. This was previously called the intercompany transfer route, but the general minimum salary is going up to 48,500, but the going rates will also be increasing with the latest pay data. Similarly, for graduate trainees under the Global Business Mobility route, that's also increasing from £24,220 to £25,410, but the going rates are remaining at 70% of the 25th percentile, but updated to the latest pay data. Another change that I thought I'd flag on the next slide is the immigration health surcharge increase. So as many of you know who've been going through the sponsorship process recently, the immigration health surcharge has increased. So it has increased for applications submitted on or after the 6th of February 2024. It was previously £624, but this has increased to £1,035 per year of the visa for most applicants. For those who are under 18 or applying for certain types of visa, such as students or youth mobility, it's slightly lower at £776 per year of the visa. There was another fee increase, and this was brought in. It's expected that it's going to curb immigration and help reduce immigration figures purely as a result of making it more expensive to obtain this visa. So on to the next slide, I wanted to flag some changes to the illegal working regime. So something that all businesses with employees will need to be aware of, so not just sponsors. The civil penalty for employing an illegal worker has increased. So for first offences, the penalty is now £45,000. So that's a threefold increase from £15,000. And then for subsequent breaches, the fine is now up to £60,000. So again, that's another threefold increase up from £20,000. It is worth bearing in mind that this is per illegal worker. As I'm sure you all know, it's therefore more important, as always, to be doing your right to work checks and to make sure you're following the latest guidance, which is in force at the time you're doing those checks, in order to have the statutory excuse against that civil penalty. The latest version of the right to work check guidance was published on the 8th of February and is effective for checks completed on or after the 13th of February. So the latest version of the guidance did include some updates. It's worth reviewing the latest version. Some key changes include those for EU nationals who were already in the UK before the 30th of June 2021. If you discovered they no longer have the right to work in the UK, some special protections for them have been removed, but it is worth checking the guidance if this comes up and it's relevant for you. There's also been some insertions in place for anyone engaging as skilled worker who's doing supplementary employment, as I mentioned earlier. And specifically, if you are looking at um, your policies, it's always worth making sure that your policies are up to date. So that's maybe a takeaway job to go away and take a look at your policies to make sure they're up to date with the latest version of the guidance and also the sponsor guidance as the changes come into force. So to continue the whistle-stop tour, it's worth flagging there's been some updates to the visitor rules affecting what overseas nationals can do whilst they're in the UK. So there is a list of permitted activities, some general business activities, and what this includes has been slightly expanded. These changes came in on the 31st of January 2024. Visitors are now expressly permitted to work remotely whilst in the UK, but that remote working must not be the primary purpose of the visit. In addition, there are certain specific activities permitted in an intra-corporate setting. There's been a specific addition where there's now some direct client working which is permitted under those rules. Do consult those rules as there are specifics that are permitted there and specific requirements about when that direct client contact can be in place. So it includes what type of projects as well as the work being incidental to the employment overseas. Check those rules if it's something you think you want to rely on. There's also been some changes impacting researchers, legal professionals, and paid speakers at conferences. So if that's relevant to you, it's definitely worth checking the new rules. And just as a takeaway point, if you have any sort of standard template invite letters, if you're inviting staff from overseas to the UK, it's worth taking a look to make sure those letters are up to date. So if we go on to the next slide, there is also an upcoming graduate route review by the Migration Advisory Committee. The graduate route, as many will know, it's a post-study work route. It lasts 2 to 3 years, but there have been over 1,000 people who were issued visas in the year ending September last year, and there's a planned review which the MAC is expecting to report on in May this year. There is the possibility that there could be a tightening of the rules on this, with some wording suggesting the aim is to support the pathways to high quality jobs, and the goal is to make sure that the graduate route is in a position to prevent abuse and protect the integrity and quality of the UK higher education system. So that's worth keeping an eye on. So in terms of key takeaways on the next slide, a key message is there anyone in your workforce who needs to be sponsored before the rules change on the 4th of April? And if so, do you have an undefined certificate of sponsorship for them or a defined cost, depending on the situation? If not, apply as soon as possible as UKVI are going to be extremely busy in the run up to the 4th of April. It's also worth upskilling on how to use the SMS and to get familiar with the rules. So I'm sure some training for HR staff will need to be arranged to get ready for these dual rules which will be in place. And then similarly, if sponsorship isn't going to work, are there any other visas that might be an option? You might have to think about how your recruitment process is going to be operating. As I mentioned, it's worth taking a look at your right to work policy and sponsorship policies to make sure they're up to date. And if you're going to be taking a look at any business visits to the UK in the near future, make sure you have a look at your templates and the rules to see if your permitted activities are acceptable. So that takes us on to a couple of Q&As, if we've got time for a couple.
Yeah, I think we've got
Um,
a minute or two. I've got one here for you, Gregor, if you want to start. So somebody
okay.
saying they've been struggling to get a couple of undefined certificates of sponsorship and they're concerned about the timescales because they want to sponsor employees on graduate route visas who are currently on grad visas before the 4th of April. Is there anything they can do to speed up the process?
Yep, so to get an undefined certificate of sponsorship, they will need to be looking at using the priority service. It will be critical to use that as there's not time to kind of use the standard processing time, which can take up to 18 weeks. So the key is they want to be able to assign the costs no later than the 3rd of April. We are aware of delays in processing certificates of sponsorship. So it might be worth, if you are putting it into the putting in priority service requests to provide some details of the expiry dates that you're working to. But it's best to get those requests in and to get the priority service as early as possible. If you're at the stage where you're running out of time, it may be worth taking advice.
Okay. And there's another one here which I can just take. We'll maybe finish up after that one because we're just about out of time. We're in the process of going through a selection process for a job. The top candidate is based in the EU, is an EU national. She'll qualify for sponsorship under the current rules, but won't once the new ones come into force. What parts of the sponsorship process do we need to complete before the cut-off date? So I guess we've covered that already. You need to assign the certificate of sponsorships. You've got to have one available to be able to do that. The latest date for doing that's the 3rd of April, but ideally you would also want to get the visa applied for if you could before the cut-off date, and think about things like English language requirement. Is a test going to need to be done? What other paperwork's going to be needed to get everything in order to do as much as possible before the 3rd of April? I think we'll leave it at that. I think we've got some extra questions that have come through, but as I said, we'll try and come back to you on those separately because we're just about out of, or we're already out of time. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.